Excellencies, distinguished guests, it's a great honor for me to be able to talk to you today. I would like to talk about one particular aspect of international cooperation where we can learn from a lot of lessons from across the world and in which we have a lot of common responsibilities. And I want to talk about issues to do with humanitarian aid, the kind of support we give during extreme events, during disasters, during deep crisis, as indeed affects the world quite regularly. I think it's also quite opportune to talk to you here in Beijing about this, not least in a year where we have seen Chinese health workers in Sierra Leone helping to stop the epidemic of Ebola. We have seen China taking a big role in responses to the Nepal earthquake not so long ago. It's in a period where many more different parts of the international system are thinking more about these important questions of how can we do this better. Of course, this is all in the context of big development challenges, and history, but also the present, as already was alluded to, is still blighted by lots of poverty. And I'm particularly concerned here with the most basic of needs, satisfaction, having enough food, having enough basic nutrition, health, educational chances, and so on. There are still loads of people that are not really getting this. As already was just mentioned, still an awful lot of people are still living in extreme poverty. They don't really have these basic incomes to achieve this. But we shouldn't underestimate the kind of progress that has been made in recent years. And maybe let me just look at here one little table that actually shows, this is the latest figures of the World Bank, who has been compiling this kind of comparable data on progress in the world in extreme poverty. It recently published the latest updates, and if you think of where do they have the best data on, so it's at the moment they've managed to update this to around 2012, and it's about the number of people in the world that live below some kind of comparable poverty line, this case expressed in dollars, something like $1.90 in purchasing power, that's comparable, and I think it's about 900 million people. But if you look at the bottom line there of this table, this is in a world where we've made dramatic progress. The world has been growing in population, but in 1990 we had still about 2 billion people below that line, and we've managed to reduce this by more than 1 billion in recent times. But also, if you then look across the world where a lot of this progress has been happening, of course it's extremely well known that even in the 1980s, by 1990, there was still huge amounts of extreme poverty here in China and in general in East Asia. We think about 1 billion people in East Asia around 1990, and this is of course part of the world where the biggest progress has been made, where the estimates would be probably the projections for 2015 around 83 million people. That's still a lot of people, but it's massive progress that has been made, especially there. Indeed, if we want to ask, has the world made progress in these Millennium Development Goals? Well, yes, it has achieved the goal of halving extreme poverty by 2050 compared to 1990. But had it not been for China, we wouldn't have achieved it. It's definitely a very big part of the whole puzzle. But if you then look at where poverty is still prevalent, well, it's in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, where we're still above 300 million people. In Sub-Saharan Africa, that's a big share of the world of the population of Sub-Saharan Africa, more than 40% that is there. There is some progress now being made everywhere, but these are still significant numbers. If we want to ask ourselves, how do these things come about? Well, of course, it's been a central part of a lot of research through history to try to understand what's happening in this respect. And of course, given the kind of progress that has been made in East Asia, it's had an awful lot of attention of trying to understand, why has this progress been made, for example, in recent times in East Asia, also compared to European progress at all. And at the risk of giving you tautologies, giving you not really clear causes and causal relationships, but just the things that we've observed that seem to go together with this progress. I think there's probably about 3 things we've seen that have gone together. Is that, yes, it has been to do with economic progress, with economic growth, that it has been able to create jobs and raising incomes. And it has typically got to do with something to do with private sector investment is a big part of what's going on. But we can't deny, and it's definitely been an essential part of progress, that when countries start making really fast progress, yes, this growth is really important, but somehow or another, social sector systems and policy also evolve. Whether we look in Europe or indeed look in East Asia, the progress that has been made there has been important to give people much better lives and indeed a reduction of extreme poverty. And then finally, and this I will focus a little bit more today, is issues to do with social protection. It's somehow or another getting societies that protect people against the extreme events that can blight people's lives, that the consequences or the eradication of things like famines or the huge and dramatic consequences that people can experience, say pandemics and so on, that actually you get systems that actually can deal with this. In general, forms of social protection that avoids the most vulnerable people to suffer extreme poverty seems to be part of it. Now, I don't tell you here this is how it's come about. This is more what? I'm more or less describing what we've seen in lots of society. Then, in terms of the how, well, we just have to acknowledge this huge diversity. It is, even though researchers keep on trying to find this one factor, this essential factor that really caused progress and stopped progress elsewhere, we definitely know there's been a lot of diversity. For example, on political systems. You know, there's been an awful lot of research in economics and political science to try to say, you know, is it in the end, for example, a specific feature of your political system? Say, for example, the election system, is that the driving force and cause of eradication of extreme poverty? Well, we find countries where free and fair elections seem to take place, but actually where poverty gets, indeed, extreme poverty gets reduced. But we see also countries where this does not happen. But similarly about state leadership, there's been huge diversity in the extent to which the state is taking the lead across the world in making this progress. In some countries, and of course here in China, the state has played an essential and a big part of it. In other places, states may have tried to take the lead, but actually not really succeeding very much in this progress. So did it matter? Doesn't it matter? Or did it in the past? Or didn't it matter? I think even in East Asian progress, there's quite a lot of diversity there in all these factors. I don't think that's a really helpful way to think about the role of the state, the role of politics in this kind of progress. I'm more tempted to say that we need to look a little bit deeper what's behind the politics and behind the state. And this is given rise, learning from history, from historical research, economists and political scientists are definitely now coming to, I'm not saying consensus, there never is consensus in economics, but there is definitely a better understanding that really the underlying factors, these kind of values and norms that drive politics and economic processes in society, the rules of the game within the system, have played a central role. That was North, but also more recently, Acemoglu and Judd Robinson have been writing very clearly and very articulate ways about some of these processes, maybe simplifying quite a long way. But it is actually quite striking. The correlation between somehow institutional matters, and the one that I really want to pick out when it is about the eradication of extreme poverty, a fundamental commitment by the political class, and a fundamental commitment to growth and development seems to be an essential part of it. And we still see across the world politics that not always has the strong commitment towards this. And in other parts where there's strong commitment, and I do think that's definitely a common factor across East Asia during crucial periods, a fundamental commitment by the political elite that growth is a source of legitimacy, that development is a source of legitimacy, as something that was quite essential. And combined with that is the development of something to do with state capabilities. Whether it's deep interference or more or less unfair, it is to do with the state knowing and understanding better its place and allowing systems to develop that can support or to lead the processes, and state leadership clearly has played a role. This is different from simply reducing the political system itself. It is more to go with the underlying features, institutional features of different political systems and state systems. So in China, we may have had very strong state capability coming from history, but also strong leadership commitment to growth and development, crucial parts of the last 35 years, where in other countries, maybe the state or the political class understood better that maybe stepping a step back is maybe being a better thing. I sometimes think, for example, in Bangladesh, that despite a poorly functioning state, actually we've seen quite a lot of progress. And where sometimes when you talk to at least some scholars in Bangladesh and say, well, the state recognizing that taking the lead wasn't the best idea in its own history and its own structures may have been helpful in getting quite substantial poverty reduction in recent times as well. I'm not talking about underlying forces to sustain your growth. I'm underlying forces here for me for what it is to do with extreme poverty and getting these first phases. We could have much longer debates about what would be needed for sustaining progress and growth, but where typically people will refer to, at least to Western capitalist societies, that innovation and renewal in politics and economy and having systems that allow that have been quite important further on. But let me actually move on a little bit more specifically to one aspect. This afternoon, some of you will get a chance, and I will talk a little bit about what this means for development, say, in Africa, and the kind of state that we observe there. But while I now want to talk much more specifically for my remaining time on the issue to do with this kind of social safety net, the security that has been offered, the protection that the state and political elites and the essential role that they play in providing this protection to extreme events and during extreme periods. Because it is definitely my proposition here that it's really a fair test to actually look at the opportunities and the chances of development and their progress, is to actually observe how states and politics is acting during periods of extreme events such as droughts, earthquakes, and pandemics. And it also tells us maybe what we can do and how humanitarian aid can work better in a world where this is definitely something of global responsibility, but sometimes failing people as well. So my proposition is, look, we're not going to get rid of earthquakes, we're not going to get rid of epidemics, we're not going to get rid of extreme events in weather. In fact, climate change is going to get more extreme events to be the norm. But what we can definitely avoid is them to turn into humanitarian disasters and pandemics. That's an option we have, and it's an option we can take. But how disasters evolve from this kind of extreme events such as droughts or epidemics and earthquakes is really a reflection of the success of the state and its development, and also tells us quite a lot where it can go next. I think it's a fair test of the political commitment of elites, it's a fair test of the state capabilities. And then finally, the global humanitarian system could overcome some of these failures. But I do think there's a lot of work to be done in the near future to get much better governance and organization, and indeed if it's finance, to be able for the global system to play this role. I will use Ethiopia and Somalia as examples here and there. In fact, I'll talk quite a few examples. I'll also mention the experiences I've had being somewhat involved from the backroom, so to speak, on the Ebola epidemic in West Africa recently. The history of disasters, every country has known. Droughts, famines, floods, earthquakes, they have caused devastation across the world. I have pictures here on the top right. This is a picture from the Irish famine. Medieval plagues were definitely something we also hear an awful lot about, but up to the 19th century, it was a common feature to also get famines in Europe, in Western Europe as well. We got them in the 20th century, but then more linked to conflict, for example, in Holland in 1944. We also got them, of course, in Asia. China is littered in history with famines and the consequences of big disasters. But also, you know, the whole of South Asia, for example, think of during colonial administration, during the Bengal famine in 1943, where millions of people died as a consequence of extreme events, but also the way this then was handled by state systems and politics. We know, of course, in China, the Henan famine during in 1942, very much millions of people died there, or indeed the big large-scale starvation and famine during parts of the Great Leap Forward, 1958 to 1961. They are still amongst really the big historical famines of the 20th century. There is definitely a history. We also have a history of epidemics. You know? China has known them. Although epidemics increasingly, they may cause a lot of suffering and lots of problems, they're rarely causing big pandemics of a very large scale of the sort with very high mortality. Even the Ebola epidemic, in the end, was relatively modest in its mortality compared to some of the recent famines, with 13,300 people that died. Earthquakes and tsunami, of course, is still the biggest disaster that Asia has seen in recent time, with hundreds of thousands of people dying across the Indian Ocean region as well. These things will still happen. We can't avoid them. But again, it's to do with how we respond and how we deal with this. Although in most recent years, high mortality is typically only found really in very poor countries. Some of the biggest famines induced by initially climate events is definitely still the 1984-85 famine, probably 500,000, maybe more even, people died in the context of conflict. The Haiti earthquake, probably something like 160,000 people died there, and the Somalia drought in 2011 is definitely in the last 10 years by far the biggest, probably 200,000, maybe a bit less. The figures are very hard to come by, but it's very striking if we think of the recent ones, the Ethiopian ones in 84-85 or Somalia. It's in the middle of conflict as well. And we can actually safely say, and I will develop that a bit further, is that actually these extreme mortality rates, it is typically now a feature largely of conflict situations, drought, but still, you know, the tens of thousands of people that suffer during big events, or indeed, as I mentioned already, Ebola in West Africa, is still, of course, numbers that are far too big to have. Think also of the Nepal earthquake, about 8,000 people died there. These are still big numbers, and also some of these deaths we can definitely say are avoidable. So the general perception is the very extreme high mortality, hundreds of thousands, is unlikely to occur these days except for in conflict or in very specific situations. But large-scale suffering is definitely there. For example, at the moment in East Africa, there's a drought taking place linked to El Nino. In Ethiopia, there is a real risk that this could be a very big drought. Probably something like maybe 8, maybe 12 million people are at risk. We are confident that this is not going to be the kind of massive mortality of 84-85, but it still means a lot of hunger, a lot of suffering, a lot of problems for a lot of people across the world. In general, large-scale suffering, I think, is avoidable, and as very poor countries, not least the Asian experience has been that famines definitely are now a thing of largely of the past, and indeed, the large-scale suffering is much better contained than it was in recent times. So how do you avoid that? Well, it is my contention that it has to do, this is something to do with the responsibility of how the state and politics respond to this. And it's very clear that we look at virtually all the big disasters that get out of hand and cause a lot of mortality, that how the state responded to it and how politics responded to it have been essential features. It has to do with a lot with national political commitment and with the state capabilities. These essential features also of subsequent success in fighting extreme poverty and indeed getting development going. To give some examples, the very striking thing that during conflict situations we do get these big disasters still develop. Well, it's fundamentally a fundamental failure of state and politics as well. If we think of Somalia, 2011 should not have turned into the kind of massive mortality of hundreds of thousands of people. But conflict didn't allow responses, didn't really allow anyone really to get close. Al-Shabaab had a big role in that as well. Responses were very difficult. But it gets worse than that. Because not only creates conflict these kind of extreme circumstances and these crises, it also creates situations where famine becomes an act of war as well. Where actually the state uses famine as a way of containing populations. There is a concern, definitely in the 1980s, and sometimes even more recently, that in Darfur in Sudan, that hunger is being used as a weapon also in conflict situations. We definitely have the evidence that during the 84-85 famine in Ethiopia, it was a lot to do with acts of conflict and strategies by the military regime that actually exacerbated all these crimes. Now, that's a fundamental failure of the state. You know, development will never occur in a fundamental conflict situation. Indeed, it's even worse. Suffering increases, for example, via this kind of extreme events. But more closely to home, and virtually every country in the world that is facing, whether it's an earthquake or an epidemic, or whether it's a big shock in drought, appropriate systems and incentives. We see all over the world, they're failing to a large extent or to some extent. And it's really important that without appropriate systems and incentives, states tend to respond very poorly. So take the first one, it's incentives for information. It was definitely the case in 84-85 that the government in Ethiopia tried to repress the fact that there was a famine. It's still something we occasionally hear of the repressing of the information. One worries sometimes, say in North Korea, the repressing of the information that actually things are happening exacerbate the crisis. At least from what I've read, I've not read enough, but also in the Henan famine in 1942, there was a clear sense of information being repressed and not being passed on up in the system that actually allows some kind of responses. We know this with epidemics. We know that here in China, during SARS, there has been an acknowledgement that actually information should have been much more quickly open, and WHO has been working with Chinese authorities to improve these kind of issues. And it's the kind of thing, you know, especially, we may have all kinds of ideas of press freedom and social media and so on, but to actually deal with disasters, they become valuable allies to actually get quick responses. Information flows have been very strong. And for example, Amartya Sen, who has been, I think, at this forum before, has also very much written about how in post-Indian independence, post-colonial India, it was the press that was a crucial part why India never had a famine again. That actually it did make politicians aware because the press would write about these things. But information is not enough. Ebola has shown that information is only one thing. If you don't have incentives for action, nothing will happen. Yes, we are very concerned that the West Africa authorities knew by the end of 2013 that there were Ebola cases in Guinea. They knew by January, February that there were cases getting into Sierra Leone as well. It took until well into March, and largely because NGO, Médecins Sans Frontières, Médecins Without Borders, declared an emergency in Guinea, that actually the authorities called in the WHO, the World Health Organization, which is their obligation to actually come and help with the response. That's information that came too late. But it also took the World Health Organization until end of July, early August, to declare a health emergency. And it was only then that help was called in, including from China, from the UK, from the US, to actually go and respond. Early information is great if it's no early action and procrastination. it's a really big mistake. It's one of the lessons of Ebola, that if we acted even just 1 month earlier, we would have avoided thousands of deaths. If we acted 6 months earlier, it probably would have talked about a few hundred people that died, as in most Ebola outbreaks in history, and not the 13,300 that we now face. This is an important thing. You have to have incentives, not just for the information, but someone needs to act as well. You need incentives for preparedness, for planning and prioritization. What we see with earthquake responses in Haiti, in Pakistan, indeed in Nepal, that actually the preparation in the end is really lacking. Nepal is striking because we all knew a big earthquake was going to happen. Maybe not this year, maybe it wasn't 5 years, maybe it would have been 3 years ago, but the big one was about to come. Planning and prioritization for the preparedness is quite essential. It's a real issue of coordination, and it's really hard for politicians to pay much attention to this. Because politicians can make careers by showing leadership of how you respond when the cameras are rolling. But actually to prepare quietly beforehand, actually in most political systems, it's not always the incentives are not there. And it's indeed the non-visibility of incentives of risk reduction is one of these big problems we face. An example also of how you respond. Only 3 months before Haiyan, the typhoon in the Philippines, struck, there was actually a big earthquake in Pakistan. Everybody said, oh, now we're going to get better, we're going to now invest in preparedness in Pakistan. But actually, once Haiyan came, all the funds more or less flew to the Philippines, and all these funds are being reduced there now, and very little work. So how can we avoid extreme events turning into a disaster further? So I've already said, political commitment is important, and we also need some systems. We need to keep on continuing to invest in capacity response. So there are great examples, and Amartya Sen has documented that very clearly, that actually one of the reasons why, for example, in India, we started actually getting quite good responses to extreme events. Was in a big drought in 1971 in Maharashtra. It turned out that actually people had prepared, had plans in place to get actually a quick scaling up and a fast scaling up. I know of examples also that in China these kinds of responses have been put in place, and that's been very important. And this is something we need to actually help much poorer countries to get much better in place. For example, it's about mobilization of resources. There's been a great initiative working with the African Union, several other countries involved, donor countries, and also the World Food Programme, to actually get finance much more rapidly mobilized. And there's now a system where on the basis of just weather data, money gets released to countries that face a drought, and they can immediately start a response. Why is that important? Because harvests fail months after when the data are available. And if you have responses in financial needs very quickly, it can help. But you need to have systems to deliver locally. And then we have examples in Africa where there's been amazing progress. Places where nothing like that ever existed. For example, in Ethiopia, we now have a productive safety net program that most of the time provides social transfers to large groups of people, but actually during a crisis can quickly scale up and provide protection to lots of people in need. Same as a kind of program in Kenya. So what we see is actually something really positive. We see countries that take leadership and actually politically become defined important. And Bangladesh, India can be mentioned, Ethiopia, Kenya, of course China can be mentioned, that has been doing this now for many decades, having learned the lessons from what happened in the 1960s. But we do see still, and the Ebola epidemic brought it out, that without that political leadership, the willingness to say something is called wrong, and the willingness to actually step up in that case, that we actually, without that kind of leadership, and we've seen that during Ebola in West Africa, as causing a real big problem. So finally, let me say a few things on what it means for the humanitarian system. Well, we have here a distinguished guest from working in the UN system. And the UN, of course, has an incredible track record as being able to be not bound by politics, but trying to go in all kinds of settings. They are present on the ground in Syria, they are present on the ground in lots of conflict areas, in the DRC, where no one else can actually work. Donor governments, as we've seen, give lots of assistance, and indeed NGOs provide assistance too. In the UN, though, it's quite dispersed. There's lots of organizations. There's lots of groups and subgroups that are doing it. We have coordinating humanitarian aid organizations. We have World Food Programme, we have UNHCR, we have all kinds of the other UN organizations having their own roles. And then we have all the donors with their own responses, and we have loads of NGOs doing this as well. They all try to deliver, and the UN tries to coordinate. Can I assure you, it's not always that successful. The coordination of this whole effort is one of the real big features. And in fact, it's quite interesting to make a contrast, finally, between how normal aid, the typical development aid gets delivered, but why this kind of model doesn't quite work for humanitarian aid, and why new models are needed. So they have characteristics in common. It's in fact two. It's quite appropriate that development aid of the kind that the UK or that China offers to countries, for example, in Africa these days, that it should be voluntary, of course. Governments are sovereign, they should be able to invite in people to come and give support. This seems to be a reasonable proposition. But during crisis, and even situations where politics is used in kind of as a weapon, this actually creates real problems. Who can call them in? How can we get them? Or the pride of governments not calling any assistance, as we had with Ebola. It actually creates this problem. It actually is one of the things that causes the risks of inaction. And that's a real thing we need to find ways of overcoming it. The second thing is, of course, all development aid, all assistance we give to different countries, it is totally appropriate that it should be voluntary, that countries should do it willingly, give amounts of resources to another country. But it raises an interesting issue on how aid and humanitarian aid actually seems not to quite have a level playing field. In the case of development aid, countries use all kinds of instruments. China and the UK use not just grants to countries, gifts from countries to other countries. They can give it to NGOs, they can give it to organizations, but they also have all kinds of other means, including via multilateral institutions, to have credit arrangements, to get loans, to allow governments then to borrow from multilateral institutions, to get into development, to use a much broader system of financial instruments. It's very striking that the humanitarian system essentially works on a cash budget. The money that comes in can be spent. If it doesn't come in, it can be spent. And if it's about immediacy of need, this seems to be a bit striking. And what we see also in this whole system, despite UN resolutions of a global commitment for humanity, for making sure that the suffering of people is avoided, we have a system that it has to, every time there is a crisis, launch an appeal to the goodness of other nations and people to actually raise money, and then find itself that at the moment only about 30% of the appeals are fulfilled. Money doesn't really come. Even though it is seemingly a right, a part of the obligations within the UN Charter and the UN resolutions, that actually people don't follow. So you end up with an underfunded system. And everybody doing their own things. It's nice that we get all these organizations involved. Think of Nepal, it was a great thing that China came in, the UK also came in, the US came in, all the countries came in, the UN came in with every single organization. Everybody came in, and we had planes circling above Kathmandu and not able to land, because everybody was trying to come in. And we got huge delays, we didn't really have coordination, and we had fragmentation of the effort. I understand this. Every time we do an evaluation after a crisis, I can now already write the first sentence of every evaluation report of after a crisis. And it usually says, okay, we came a bit too late, but also we didn't coordinate very well. This is already what we're learning in Nepal, we didn't coordinate very well. Look, I can assure you, everybody likes to coordinate, but nobody likes to be coordinated. And there's a whole system that is basically building around the lack of coordination. So finally, what can we do about it? Well, we do need build-up systems. And I also think countries like China and all other countries that have learned to deal with these disasters, they should help with helping politics and states and countries to take these responses more seriously. If it doesn't come from the countries themselves, we're never going to get rid of some of these disasters. But we need to get strong incentives for action internationally. We need early action, not just early warning. I know there's a lot of scientists here, and they always ask for more data. But without anyone acting on data, data are useless. The global value of more data is zero unless people act on it and use it. So we need some kind of decision-making that's much more rule-based. Within the organizations, within countries, issues of governance and decision-making are clear. And we definitely need fewer begging laws. Because that's essentially how the whole humanitarian system is run. Isn't it amazing in a world where we have sophisticated financial centers all over the world, whether it's in Shanghai, Hong Kong, Wall Street, and the city of London, that the financing of the most pressing needs is done by begging laws? That's medieval. That's centuries of progress that we've just not learned from history. So why don't we think a little bit more? We could maybe learn a bit more from financial sectors, from Wall Street and the City of London, although I would say you could just learn from some Ethiopian farmers. And to finish, I'll give you how Ethiopian farmers have learned to get just much better financing models for disasters than actually the global system at the moment is using for itself. And it's a very simple thing. Funeral societies, we find them everywhere in the world. I'm sure in China we have similar models in traditional communities. Because, you may not be able to stop someone from dying, but the minimal human right is for someone to get a decent burial. And it's very clear that all over the world, a decent burial is very important. You have to have your relatives there, you have to have your families there, but that's very expensive. To the top right is a picture from Ethiopia, from a funeral. People dress up in their very best, and have these beautiful umbrellas against the sun, and they do this. But how do they finance it, if you're poor? Well, a lot of communities across the world then basically people that they can't pay for it, they beg. Or they say during the funeral they do a collection. Or, and we see this in Ethiopia already for centuries, they have a rule that you contribute a fixed amount during the funeral. Actually, Ethiopian farmers got a bit more clever about 100 years ago. They basically said, look, this doesn't work really, because something bad could have happened just when there's a funeral and I can't really have to do my job. Let me actually do something a bit more sensible. Why don't we beforehand, every month, pay a bit of money to the secretary of our little funeral society and collect some money, and basically they've set up a mutual insurance company. We find in every community in Ethiopia, dozens of them. It's quite funny, every international organization, I bet the Chinese embassy will have a lot of Ethiopian staff, and India, I know the World Bank staff have their own funeral society. Basically, they pay every month, a fixed amount. If you can't afford it, you can delay it by a month or two, but there's strict rules. If you don't pay, you'll get kicked out, just like an insurance contract. And then actually, when there's a funeral, there's a very clear sense this is what we will be contributing. And this is very clear what we will be giving. So why don't we set up an international system that is rule-based contribution before disasters? If you're willing to give more than 150 billion of ODA, overseas development assistance, and much more when we take all the other ways of doing this, why can't we do this rule-based? And think of it as if you are actually having a global insurance company. The global humanitarian system has insurance, where we have clear rules that everybody needs to do, where we have to have incentives for preparedness, where we also have payouts after disasters very clearly linked to the need and also with very quick triggers. We do have a few of these. And we have, for example, systems like that in the Caribbean against insurance against tropical storms. We have it in Africa now, with money being pooled together so that actually countries can get on the basis of weather shocks to happen. I know in the UN we have the SURF, but actually that's kind of a fund that gets together. It's still far too voluntary contribution based. It would be so much better. So to conclude, what's my propositions? Extreme events, they will keep on happening. But it's a real sign of the quality of your states and your politics that you learn to deal with this properly. We have an option to avoid this, and actually the commitment of politics and of the state is essential there. There we have very little doubt in terms of our analysis. But the global humanitarian system is quite medieval in its organization, at least in its financing. We should be able to do a bit better in helping these states to cope with this crisis properly. We should do better governance, much more early action, much better organization, including of its financing. Thank you very much.